Welcome to Revenge Chronicles. The email notification chimed on my phone at 3:47 a.m. Another sleepless night spent writing, editing, reliving memories I'd rather forget. But this email was different. It wasn't another rejection letter or form response from a publisher. The subject line made my hands shake. "Congratulations, your memoir has been selected for publication." I sat in my tiny studio apartment, surrounded by years of journals, therapy notes, and legal documents I'd collected since aging out of foster care at 18. The manuscript that had just changed my life was titled Invisible Girl, a foster child's journey to finding her voice. And it was dedicated to every child who was never believed, never protected, never valued. But the real story began 23 years ago, when I was 7 years old and first walked into Margaret Hendricks' house on Maple Street. I still remember that day perfectly. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, had promised me this would be different. "Mrs. Hendricks has been fostering children for 15 years, she'd said in the car. "She's experienced, stable. This could be your forever home, Sarah." Forever. I'd clung to that word like a life raft. After 3 failed placements, I desperately wanted to believe someone might actually want me. Margaret Hendricks was a tall, stern woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her house was immaculate, everything in its place, not a speck of dust anywhere. She showed me to my room, a small space with white walls, a single bed, and a dresser. No decorations, no personal touches. It felt more like a hospital room than a bedroom. "Rules are simple," she told me that first day, her voice cold and businesslike. "You'll earn your keep here. Chores start at 6 a.m. School, then more chores. Dinner is at exactly 6 p.m. Bedtime is 8:30. No exceptions, no excuses. You're lucky to have a roof over your head, and don't you forget it." I nodded eagerly, willing to do anything to belong somewhere. I didn't understand then that Margaret didn't see me as a child who needed love and guidance. She saw me as a paycheck and free labor. The abuse wasn't physical, Margaret was too smart for that. It was constant, grinding psychological warfare designed to break my spirit. Every morning started with her listing my failures from the previous day. "You left water spots on the bathroom mirror. You didn't fold the towels correctly. You breathed too loudly during dinner." When I brought home my first report card with straight A's, I thought she'd be proud. Instead, she examined it with a frown. "B+ in gym class? What's wrong with you? Too lazy to run properly?" I tried harder. I became obsessed with perfection, spending hours making sure every chore was done exactly right. But it was never enough. Margaret had a talent for finding fault in everything I did. The worst part was how she'd treat me in front of others. When social workers came for their quarterly visits, she'd transform into the perfect foster mother. She'd put her arm around me, speak in warm tones about my progress, show off the clean house as evidence of what a good home she provided. "Sarah is such a blessing," she'd say, squeezing my shoulder just hard enough to remind me to smile and nod. "She's really flourishing here." The social workers would check off their boxes and leave, never noticing the fear in my eyes or the way I flinched when Margaret touched me. At school, I was quiet, invisible. Teachers saw a well-behaved foster child who didn't cause trouble. What they didn't see was that I'd learned not to speak up because every word I said at home was wrong, every opinion I expressed was stupid, every feeling I had was invalid. The isolation was suffocating. Margaret rarely let me have friends over, claiming other children would disturb the peace of her home. When I asked to join the school's creative writing club, she laughed. "Writing? What's the point of that? You need to focus on practical skills. Nobody's going to pay you to write stories about your feelings." But writing became my escape. In secret, hidden under my mattress, I kept journals. I wrote about everything: the daily humiliations, the loneliness, the way Margaret would compare me to her previous foster children, always unfavorably. "Amanda was so much more grateful," she'd say when I didn't thank her enthusiastically enough for a meal. "She appreciated everything I did for her. Not like you." Years passed in this pattern. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, more invisible. I convinced myself that Margaret was right. I was difficult, ungrateful, damaged. Who would want a kid like me? The breaking point came during my junior year of high school. I'd been working on a college application essay about overcoming adversity. My English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been encouraging me to apply for scholarships, believing I had real potential. I'd been so careful to keep the essay hidden, working on it only at school. But somehow Margaret found it. I came home from school to find her standing in my room, holding the printed pages, her face twisted with rage. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, waving the essay at me. "You wrote about living here? About me?" The essay hadn't mentioned her by name, but it talked about feeling unwanted, about learning to find strength in difficult circumstances. To Margaret, it was a betrayal. "I've given you everything," she screamed. "A home, food, clothes, and this is how you repay me? By writing lies about your life here." She tore the essay into pieces, letting the fragments fall to the floor. "You're nothing, Sarah. You'll always be nothing. No college is going to want some foster kid with delusions of grandeur. You should be grateful I've put up with you this long." That night, I sat on my bedroom floor picking up the torn pieces of my essay. As I tried to tape them back together, something inside me snapped. For the first time in 10 years, I felt anger instead of shame. Real, burning anger at the injustice of it all. I wasn't nothing. I wasn't worthless. And I wasn't going to let Margaret Hendricks define my worth anymore. I rewrote the essay from memory, this time being more honest about my experiences. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me apply for a full scholarship to the state university. When the acceptance letter came, I intercepted it before Margaret could see it. On my 18th birthday, I packed my few belongings into a single duffel bag. Margaret was at her weekly church meeting, the same church where she presented herself as a saint who sacrificed her life to help troubled children. I left a note on the kitchen table: "Thank you for teaching me exactly the kind of person I never want to become." College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was free to discover who I really was. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in English with a focus on creative writing. I started therapy, slowly unlearning years of programmed self-doubt. Most importantly, I kept writing. Every painful memory, every moment of cruelty, every instance where I'd been made to feel less than human, I wrote it all down. My therapist said it was part of healing, but I knew it was something more. It was documentation. Evidence. Truth. I graduated summa cum laude and went on to earn my master's degree in social work. I wanted to help other foster children, to be the advocate I'd never had. But the writing never stopped. My journals from childhood had grown into something bigger, something that demanded to be shared. During my graduate program, I interned at the same agency that had placed me with Margaret. Mrs. Chen was still there, now a supervisor. She remembered me as one of her success stories. "You turned out so well," she said during our first meeting. "Mrs. Hendricks always spoke so highly of you. She was so proud when you went to college." I smiled tightly and said nothing. But that night, I pulled up Margaret's current foster care license online. She was still taking in children, still collecting those monthly checks, still presenting herself as a pillar of the community. The thought of other children enduring what I had endured made me physically sick. That's when I knew my memoir wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about justice. I spent 3 years crafting the book, working with a therapist to process each chapter as I wrote it. I interviewed other former foster children, social workers, experts on childhood trauma. I wanted the book to be more than just my story. I wanted it to expose the systemic failures that allow children to fall through the cracks. The hardest chapter to write was about Margaret. I struggled with how much to reveal, how specific to be. In the end, I decided on complete honesty. I changed her name to Martha Henderson and moved the location to a different state, but everything else was exactly as it happened. I described the emotional abuse, the isolation, the way she'd performed kindness for the social workers while crushing my spirit in private. I wrote about the fear, the self-doubt, the years of believing I was worthless because that's what I'd been told every day. But I also wrote about resilience, about the power of education, about finding chosen family among friends and mentors who actually cared about my well-being. I dedicated the book to every foster child who was told they didn't matter. You do. Your voice matters. Your story matters. You matter. The publication process was intense. My editor warned me that the book would likely generate controversy, that people might question my memories or motivations. I was ready for that. I had documentation, journals, therapy notes, school records that showed the academic excellence Margaret had dismissed as worthless. When the book was finally released, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within weeks, it had climbed to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Readers connected with the story, sharing their own experiences of childhood trauma and resilience. But the most meaningful responses came from other former foster children. I received hundreds of emails and letters from people who said my story had helped them feel less alone, less damaged, less convinced that their suffering was their own fault. The media attention was surreal. I appeared on morning shows, gave interviews to major newspapers, spoke at conferences about foster care reform. With each interview, I made sure to mention the dedication, to emphasize that this wasn't just my story, it was the story of thousands of children who deserved better. 3 months after publication, I was doing a book signing in the city where I'd grown up. The bookstore was packed, the line stretching around the block. I was in the middle of signing copies when I looked up and froze. Margaret Hendricks was standing in line, about 10 people back. She looked older, her hair completely grey now, but I'd recognize those cold eyes anywhere. She was holding a copy of my book, her face unreadable. My hand started shaking. For a moment, I was 7 years old again, terrified of disappointing this woman who held all the power in my small world. But then I remembered who I was now, not the scared, invisible girl she'd tried to break, but a successful author whose voice was finally being heard. When she reached the front of the line, she set the book down on the table without a word. I looked up at her, my pen hovering over the title page. "Hello, Margaret," I said quietly. "So this is what you've been up to," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of disapproval. "Making money off of lies about people who tried to help you." I felt that old familiar twist in my stomach, the programmed response to her criticism. But this time, something was different. I wasn't alone anymore. I was surrounded by readers who had connected with my story, who understood what I'd survived. "They're not lies," I said, my voice steady. "Every word in this book is true. And you know it." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You were a difficult child, Sarah. Ungrateful. I did my best with what I was given." I thought about the dedication page, about all the emails I'd received from other survivors, about the foster children who were still out there, still being told they were burdens, still being made to believe they deserved less than love. "Your best wasn't good enough," I said, signing my name with a flourish. "And now everyone knows it." I handed her the book. She stared at the signature for a long moment, then looked back at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before, uncertainty. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I am," I said simply. "For the first time in my life, I really am." She left without another word. I watched her walk away, this woman who had once held the power to make me feel worthless with a single glance. Now she was just another reader, carrying a book that told the truth about who she really was. The book signing continued, but my hands had stopped shaking. Person after person told me how my story had affected them, how it had helped them understand their own experiences or the experiences of children they knew. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, approached near the end of the evening. "I aged out of foster care last year," she said quietly. "I read your book and for the first time I realized that what happened to me wasn't my fault. I'm starting college in the fall. I want to be a teacher." That's when I knew the book had accomplished everything I'd hoped for. It wasn't just about exposing Margaret or getting revenge for my own pain. It was about breaking the cycle, about ensuring that other children would have advocates, would know their worth, would never have to suffer in silence. 6 months later, I received a call from a reporter at the local newspaper in my hometown. Margaret's foster care license had been suspended pending an investigation. 3 former foster children had come forward after reading my book, sharing their own stories of emotional abuse and neglect. I felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction, yes, but also sadness for the children who had come after me, who had endured what they shouldn't have had to endure because the system had failed them too. The investigation led to Margaret losing her license permanently. She could never foster another child. The house on Maple Street was sold, the money going toward a settlement for the children she had harmed. My book continued to generate discussions about foster care reform, about the need for better screening and monitoring of foster families, about the importance of listening to children and believing their experiences. I used my platform to advocate for legislative changes, speaking before state committees about the need for more rigorous oversight and better training for social workers. I established a scholarship fund for former foster children pursuing higher education, funding it with proceeds from my book sales. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 2 years after publication, when I received a letter from a social worker in another state. She wrote that she'd read my book and recognized concerning patterns in one of her cases. Because of what I'd written, she was able to remove a child from a harmful situation before serious damage was done. "Your story saved this little girl," she wrote. "She's now in a loving home where she's thriving. I thought you should know that your courage to speak out is still protecting children." I keep that letter framed on my desk as I work on my second book. This one is about healing, about building chosen family, about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. But I'll never stop telling the hard truths about childhood trauma and the systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable children. The scared, invisible girl who once believed she was worthless is gone. In her place stands a woman who understands her value, who has found her voice, who uses that voice to speak for those who haven't found theirs yet. Margaret Hendricks tried to convince me I was nothing. She was wrong. I am living proof that survivors can transform their pain into purpose, their silence into strength, their invisibility into impact. Every foster child deserves to know that their story matters, that their pain is real, that their future can be different from their past. My book is just one story, but it's connected to thousands of others, creating a chorus of voices that can no longer be ignored. Before you go, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and justice. These narratives matter, and your support helps us continue sharing them. Thank you so much for taking the time to experience Sarah's journey with us today. Her courage to speak truth to power reminds us all that our voices have the power to change lives. Please consider watching more of our videos, where we explore the incredible strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity.